The courtroom was already filled when the young man walked in that morning. People had come early, hoping to get a good seat. Some were curious, some were judgmental, and some were simply there because stories like this always attracted attention. The room felt heavy, almost like the air carried the weight of everyone's thoughts. The wooden benches, the tall windows, the sharp sound of papers being shuffled all added to the tension. The young man kept his eyes low as he entered. He wasn't the kind of person who liked being the center of attention. Even before this case began, he had always been quiet, someone who didn't speak unless needed. Today, surrounded by strangers who had already formed opinions about him, he looked even more withdrawn. His steps were slow, almost unsure, as if he wasn't walking toward the front of a courtroom, but toward something even heavier. Some people whispered when they saw him. It was nothing loud, but in a silent room, even the softest whispers felt sharp. A few people stared directly at him, not even trying to hide their judgment. They didn't know anything about him beyond what they had heard, but they acted like they had already figured him out. To them, his silence meant guilt. His calm face meant he didn't care. His lack of reaction made him suspicious. They didn't understand that some people stay quiet because they are scared, not because they are hiding something. He reached the table where his lawyer sat. The lawyer gave him a small nod, trying to give some comfort, but the young man only sat down quietly. He didn't say a word. The lawyer had spent days trying to get him to open up, to tell his side, to explain what really happened. But the young man had spoken very little, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to explain everything. Some truths are difficult to say, especially when no one believes you. The judge entered a few moments later, and everyone stood. The judge looked tired, like someone who had seen too many cases and too many arguments. After everyone sat, the judge glanced at the young man with a look that was neither kind nor harsh, just impatient, like he expected nothing new to happen today. To the judge, this case looked simple. The evidence, the witnesses, the statements, they all pointed in one direction, and the accused never said anything to defend himself. That only made the judge more convinced that the case was almost over. But people in the room didn't know what had happened behind the scenes. They didn't know that the young man had been holding something inside for weeks. They didn't know he was scared of speaking because he feared his words would be twisted or ignored. They didn't know he carried a pressure so heavy that even breathing felt difficult some days. All they saw was silence. And silence is something people often misunderstand. The prosecutor stood and began speaking confidently. He walked around the room as he explained how the young man seemed uninterested in defending himself. He talked about how the evidence spoke louder than the accused ever had. His voice was firm and sharp, each word thrown out like it was meant to cut. Every time he pointed toward the young man, the people sitting in the benches nodded, as if everything made perfect sense. The young man didn't look up. He kept his hands folded, staring at the table in front of him. His face stayed calm, but inside he felt a mix of fear and frustration. He wasn't angry at the prosecutor. He wasn't angry at the judge or the people watching him. He was angry at himself for not having the courage to speak earlier. But courage doesn't come when you want. It comes when it must. As the prosecutor continued, the young man's family sat behind him. They looked worried, exhausted, and almost hopeless. They had supported him through everything, but they couldn't speak for him now. They couldn't fix what people already believed. They could only hope he would find the strength to speak for himself. The first witness came forward. She spoke confidently, explaining what she thought she saw. But even her words were shaped by assumptions. She didn't know the full story. She only knew what she believed, and in a courtroom, belief sometimes feels as strong as truth. When she finished, the prosecutor smiled slightly. It was the kind of smile that said he felt closer to winning. The judge took notes, barely looking at the young man. The judge had already formed an opinion, even if he didn't say it aloud. The case looked clear to him. A quiet accused, a strong prosecutor, confident witnesses, what else was there? He didn't expect anything different today. He didn't expect any surprises. But what no one realized was that the young man had been listening closely to everything. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. He had been waiting for the right moment, the moment when speaking the truth would actually make a difference. He knew that saying something too early, too weakly, or too emotionally could be used against him. So he stayed quiet, even though that silence made him seem guilty. His lawyer leaned toward him at one point and whispered gently, asking if he wanted to speak now. But the young man shook his head lightly. It wasn't time yet. He didn't know when the right time would come, but he trusted that he would feel it. Minutes turned into an hour. The courtroom grew more tense. People shifted in their seats. Even those who had come out of curiosity began to feel impatient. They wanted something dramatic, something unexpected, but courtrooms rarely give that. Most days are just slow speeches, papers, evidence, and quiet observers. Nothing exciting today felt like one of those slow days. But something was building quietly under the surface, something no one sensed yet. The young man lifted his eyes briefly and looked around. He saw people who didn't believe in him. He saw strangers waiting to see him crumble. He saw his family trying to stay strong. He saw his lawyer hoping for a miracle. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He didn't speak. Not yet, but something small changed in his expression. It was the look of someone who was slowly gathering courage. As the prosecutor finished another statement, the judge let out a tired sigh. "If there is nothing new," the judge said, "we will soon move toward closing." Those words hit the young man deeply. Closing meant the end. Closing meant no turning back. Closing meant he would be judged based on what others said, not on what really happened. He felt his heart beating faster. His hands trembled slightly under the table. The moment he had been avoiding for weeks was approaching, whether he wanted it or not. He knew he couldn't remain silent forever. Silence had protected him at first, but now it was hurting him. No one in the room knew that the young man was moments away from making a decision that would change everything. They didn't see the quiet determination forming inside him. They didn't sense that the truth, his truth, was finally ready to come out. All they knew was that he had been silent since the beginning. They assumed he would continue that silence until the end, but they were wrong. The young man was getting ready to speak, and when he finally did, the entire courtroom would never forget. The tension inside the courtroom felt even heavier when the session continued after a short break. People returned to their seats with cups of water or quiet conversations, but their eyes always drifted back to the young man sitting silently at the front. It was almost like he carried a question mark on his forehead. Everyone wanted to know why he refused to speak. Some believed he was hiding something. Others thought he simply didn't care. Only a few wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something deeper going on. The prosecutor returned with a confident walk, carrying a small stack of papers. He placed them on the table loudly, as if to remind everyone of his control over the situation. The sound echoed in the room, causing the young man's family to tense up again. The prosecutor began by calling another witness. This one was a middle-aged man who looked nervous but determined. He stepped up, adjusted his shirt, and gave a quick glance toward the young man. His eyes held a mixture of uncertainty and familiarity, like someone who wasn't fully sure of what he was saying but wanted to appear confident. He began speaking, explaining what he thought he saw on the day everything happened. His voice shook slightly at first, but as he continued, he became more firm. He talked about moments he wasn't completely sure about, but presented them as if they were facts. People in the room nodded, absorbing every word. The judge kept writing notes, barely pausing. The young man listened quietly. His hands were folded, but his fingers kept tapping lightly. It was the only sign that he felt uneasy. He wanted to correct the things being said. He wanted to speak, but he didn't want to say anything incomplete or emotional. He wanted the full truth to be heard at the right moment, not in small pieces that might confuse people. His lawyer leaned close again, whispering gently, "If you want to speak now, this would help." But the young man shook his head slightly. His mind wasn't ready. His heart wasn't steady enough. And he knew if he spoke now, he might break down or say something in a way that could be misunderstood. Some truths need a calm voice, not a trembling one. As the witness finished, the prosecutor smiled again, a small, sharp smile. He looked like someone who already felt victorious. He presented another piece of evidence, something that seemed important on the surface, but did not tell the whole story. People whispered again. Their whispers filled the quiet spaces like tiny drops of doubt. The judge finally looked up at the young man. For the first time that day, the judge's eyes showed a hint of curiosity. Not sympathy, not understanding, just curiosity. "Do you have anything to say about this evidence?" the judge asked. The room became still. Everyone turned toward the young man. His lawyer looked hopeful. His family held their breath, but the young man stayed silent. His throat felt tight. His mind raced, but his lips did not move. After a few moments, he simply lowered his gaze again. Some people shook their heads, disappointed. Others exchanged looks that said they believed he was guilty. A few even whispered that he must have something terrible to hide. No one imagined the real reason behind his silence, fear that words alone would not save him unless they were spoken at the right moment, with the full truth beside them. The judge sighed, a long and tired sigh, and signaled for the next witness. This time it was a woman who seemed confident from the moment she stepped forward. She spoke clearly and in detail. She described things she thought happened, filling the room with her version of events. Her confidence made some people forget that she might be mistaken. In court, confidence often sounds like truth, even when it is in single quotes. The young man listened closely again. Some parts of her statement were true. Other parts were twisted by misunderstanding. A few details were completely wrong. He felt the weight of every incorrect word pressing deeper into him. His chest tightened. It was painful to stay silent while hearing things that could change his future forever. Still, he didn't speak. His lawyer looked at him again, this time with concern. The lawyer had done everything possible, but without the young man's voice, their defense looked weak. And everyone watching could see that weakness. The judge asked the witness a few questions, then thanked her. After she stepped down, The prosecutor used her statements to argue that the young man's silence only made him look more suspicious. His words seemed to float through the courtroom with power, shaping people's opinions even further. The judge looked at the young man again. This time, the question was sharper. "Are you certain you do not wish to say anything?" Again, silence. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't disrespect. It was fear, confusion, pain, and a deep worry that no one would believe him. The truth he carried wasn't simple or short. It wasn't something he could explain in a minute or two. It was something heavy, complicated, and emotional. He needed the right moment, the right strength, and the right clarity to speak it. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The session continued. Papers were exchanged. More comments were made. The prosecutor kept building a story that made the young man look worse by the minute. The judge began to appear convinced. People watching leaned forward, waiting for the final blow. The young man's family looked broken. His mother wiped her eyes quietly. His father stared at the floor, unable to handle the pressure. His younger siblings squeezed their hands together tightly, wishing they could do something, anything, to make things better. The young man finally looked back at them. Their fear hurt him more than anything else. He wanted to stand up and tell the truth in that moment, but his voice wouldn't come out. It stayed trapped inside him like a bird that wanted to fly but didn't know if the sky was safe. As the hours passed, the weight in the room grew heavier. Even the people who believed he was guilty began to feel uneasy. Something about his silence felt unusual, not cold, not arrogant, but deeply sorrowful. A few people whispered that maybe he was scared. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe there was more to the story than anyone realized. The prosecutor began to wrap up his points, summarizing everything in a firm tone. He repeated how the accused had refused to speak. He repeated how the evidence seemed strong. He repeated how silence spoke louder than any words. When he finished, the courtroom became very quiet. The judge leaned back in the chair, rubbing the forehead gently as if thinking. "If nothing changes," the judge said slowly, "we may begin closing statements soon." Those words struck the young man like cold water. Closing the case meant the truth would remain buried. Closing the case meant people would continue believing lies and assumptions. Closing the case meant his life could change forever based on misunderstandings. Something stirred inside him. His fingers stopped tapping. His breathing changed. His jaw tightened. He wasn't ready to speak yet, but he felt something shifting. A thought formed in his mind: if I don't speak soon, it will be too late. The judge gave him one final look before announcing a short recess. People stood, stretched, and talked in low voices. But the young man stayed seated. He stared at the table, his heart beating faster than before. He was scared. But he was also reaching a limit, a point where silence was no longer safe. His lawyer placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Whenever you're ready, I'll stand beside you." The young man didn't answer aloud, but something inside him finally whispered back soon, because the truth he had been holding for so long couldn't stay silent forever. And part 3 would be the moment everything changed. The courtroom returned from the short break, and everyone slowly settled back into their seats. But something felt different now. The air didn't feel as heavy as before. It felt tense in a new way, like something important was just waiting to happen. Even the judge seemed more alert when he took his seat again, as if he sensed a shift in the room. The young man sat at the front as he had before, but unlike earlier, his posture had changed slightly. He wasn't curled into himself anymore. His shoulders weren't as tight. His eyes no longer stayed glued to the table. He lifted them from time to time, looking at the judge, the prosecutor, the witnesses, and even the people in the back rows. Something inside him had begun to move, like a small spark turning into a slow-burning flame. His lawyer noticed the change immediately. Leaning closer, the lawyer whispered softly, "You don't have to speak until you're ready. But if you do, I'll support you." The young man nodded very lightly. It wasn't a promise, but it was a sign. The judge cleared his throat and looked directly at him. "Before we continue," the judge said, "I will ask once more. Do you wish to speak?" The entire courtroom turned toward him again. This time, instead of shrinking under their gaze, he sat still. His hands shook a little under the table, but his breathing stayed steady. He opened his mouth slightly, as if trying to say something, but the words didn't come yet. After a moment, he simply shook his head. The judge sighed again. But this time, it wasn't frustration. It was something closer to disappointment. Perhaps even concern. The prosecutor stood up with the same confidence as before. He looked at the judge, then at the young man, then at the audience, as if preparing them for another strong blow. He started to speak again, reminding everyone of the evidence, the statements, the silence. But the young man wasn't fully listening anymore. He heard the words, yes, but they felt distant, like echoes coming from far away. His mind was somewhere else. It was traveling through memories, through moments he had tried to bury, through situations where he wished he had spoken earlier but hadn't been able to. He remembered the day everything happened. He remembered the confusion, the pressure, the fear. He remembered wanting to explain, but also fearing that no one would believe him. He remembered the way people looked at him even before he said a single word. Those looks had shaped his silence. Those assumptions had built a wall around him, and now, brick by brick, that wall was starting to crack. As the prosecutor talked, the young man's family watched him closely. His mother held her hands together tightly, whispering silent prayers. His father sat straight, his face stern but filled with worry. His younger sibling leaned forward in their seat, waiting, hoping they could tell something was happening. The prosecutor called for another small piece of evidence to be shown. It was something simple, something the court had already seen before. But when it was displayed again, the young man stared at it in a way he hadn't earlier. His eyes narrowed slightly. A thought formed in his mind, something he hadn't realized until that moment. The prosecutor used the item to strengthen his argument again. He spoke louder now, his voice echoing, but the young man's focus stayed on the evidence. Something about it didn't match what had been said. Something didn't fit. The judge noticed his sudden attention and glanced at him. "Do you wish to respond?" the judge asked cautiously. The young man swallowed hard. He opened his mouth again. He took a breath. Nothing came out. His chest tightened with frustration. He wanted to speak so badly. He wanted to stand up and explain everything, but years of holding back had made his voice weak. Every time he tried to push words out, a wave of fear rose inside him. What if they misunderstood him again? What if they twisted his words? What if speaking only made things worse? He lowered his head again, and the judge leaned back in disappointment. But the moment wasn't lost. Something inside the young man had shifted. He was closer to speaking now than he had ever been before. The prosecutor continued, but the strength in his tone had started to weaken. He noticed the young man's sudden interest in the evidence. He noticed the judge's stare, and for the first time, A small flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He cleared his throat and tried to continue with confidence, but his rhythm was different now. He glanced at the young man more often, waiting for him to react. It was as if the prosecutor sensed that the silent figure he had been speaking over 4 days was finally waking up. Another witness was called in, this time someone who had stayed quiet until now. She stepped forward slowly, looking nervous, almost unsure if she wanted to speak at all. Her voice was soft and her hands shook as she began giving her statement. But as she spoke, a detail slipped from her mouth, a detail that the court had overlooked earlier, a detail that connected something the young man had noticed moments ago. His head lifted, his eyes widened slightly. The detail wasn't big, it wasn't loud, but it was wrong. Not wrong because she was lying, but wrong because she was mistaken. A simple misunderstanding. But that misunderstanding had changed. Everything in the case the young man's breath caught. He knew the truth behind that detail. He knew what really happened. He knew something no one else in the room understood. And suddenly, for the first time, the fear inside him began to break. His lawyer noticed the sudden change and whispered, "What is it? Tell me if you want to speak." The young man didn't respond. He wasn't ready yet, but his eyes stayed fixed on the witness as she finished her statement and stepped down. The prosecutor spoke again, trying to wrap his argument around her words. But the young man was no longer listening. All he could hear was the confusion caused by that one mistaken detail. He closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed in deeply, like someone trying to gather all the courage left inside them. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. His palms felt sweaty. His throat tightened. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't the same silent person he had been all this time. He slowly pushed his chair back. The sound was soft, barely noticeable, but in the quiet courtroom, it felt louder than it was. The judge looked at him immediately. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence. People in the audience turned. His family leaned forward, but the young man didn't stand yet. He just sat there, breathing deeply, trying to steady his thoughts. His lawyer whispered, "If you're going to speak, I'll stand beside you." The young man shook his head lightly, not as a refusal, but as a sign that he needed one more moment. The prosecutor tried to continue speaking, but his voice didn't sound as strong now. He knew something was happening. He couldn't hide his uneasiness. The judge waited. The room grew so silent that even the ticking clock on the wall sounded loud. Finally, the young man placed both his hands firmly on the table. He took one more deep breath. He lifted his head, and he stood. The sound of his chair sliding back made several people flinch. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom locked onto him. His legs trembled slightly, but he stood tall anyway. The judge spoke gently, almost softly. "Do you wish to say something?" The young man nodded slowly. The judge nodded back. "Then speak." The young man opened his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. His throat felt dry, and his heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other sound. But he didn't sit down. He forced himself to breathe. He forced himself to push past the fear that had held him captive. And then, finally, his voice broke through the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't shaky. It was steady. "I need to tell the truth," he said quietly. The entire room froze. Some leaned forward. Some covered their mouths. Some sat back in shock. But no one said a word, because for the first time since the case began, the young man had spoken, and the truth he was about to reveal would leave the entire courtroom speechless. The courtroom felt different that morning. It wasn't loud the way it had been on the first few days. It wasn't full of whispers or nervous shuffling. Instead, there was a strange calm in the air, as if everyone knew something big was about to happen. Even the judge, who had been strict and impatient throughout the trial, sat with a more serious expression than usual. Everyone seemed prepared, except the young man standing quietly near his lawyer, staring at the floor as if he was trying to gather the last bit of courage he had left. He had already spoken some part of the truth the day before, but it wasn't the full truth. He knew that. His lawyer knew that. Even a few people in the audience could sense it. It was like he had opened the first door but was scared to walk through the rest of them. And honestly, who could blame him? Telling the truth was supposed to be easy, but sometimes telling the truth was the hardest thing a person could ever do, especially when speaking up might hurt someone he still cared about. His lawyer leaned towards him and whispered, "This is the last day. Whatever you choose now will stay with you for the rest of your life." The young man nodded slowly. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He wasn't nervous about being punished anymore. What truly scared him was the idea of breaking the silence that had protected the people involved, even if they didn't deserve that protection anymore. When the judge called his name, he walked to the stand with quiet steps. The room seemed larger than usual, and every eye was on him. He sat down, placed his hands together, and took a slow breath. The judge said calmly, "Yesterday you revealed some important information. Today you have the chance to finish your statement. Remember, the court is giving you the opportunity to speak freely. Take your time." He nodded again, his throat suddenly dry. For a moment, he couldn't speak. It felt like his voice didn't want to come out. Then he looked around the room. His eyes stopped on two people sitting near the back. They avoided his gaze. That small detail finally pushed him forward. He looked at the judge and quietly said, "I didn't want to come here. I didn't want any of this to happen. But everything got out of control." The courtroom remained silent. No one even shifted in their seat. He continued, "I didn't do the things they said I did, but I also didn't explain what was really happening. I kept quiet. I thought I could handle everything myself. I thought protecting others was more important than protecting myself." His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. "But keeping quiet is what brought me here." His lawyer watched him closely, not interrupting, letting him speak from his heart. He looked down for a moment and said, "That night, I wasn't alone. The people pointing fingers at me, they were the ones who planned everything. I was just there. I shouldn't have been, but I didn't know what they were going to do. When things went wrong, they panicked. And I took the blame because I thought it would end faster if I stayed silent." A few gasps were heard from the audience. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. He continued, "They told me to stay quiet. They told me that if I didn't say anything, everything would go back to normal. But things got worse. And when the truth started coming out, they turned on me so they could save themselves." He paused again, breathing heavily as if the words were heavier than his body could carry. One of the people sitting at the back suddenly stood up, looking restless, but the guard motioned for him to sit down. The entire room noticed, and whispers started spreading like ripples. The judge tapped the desk gently. "Continue," he said. The young man swallowed hard and said, "I'm not perfect. I made mistakes. I should have spoken earlier. I should have walked away when I had the chance. But I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't cause harm. I just made the mistake of trusting the wrong people." His voice became stronger now, not louder, but clearer. "I stayed silent because I felt responsible for everyone involved. I didn't want anyone else to face trouble, but now I understand something. Staying silent doesn't protect anyone. It only lets the wrong things continue." There was something honest, deeply honest about the way he spoke. His words didn't sound rehearsed. They didn't sound like something a lawyer had prepared for him. They sounded like the truth finally coming out after being trapped inside for too long. He turned slightly and looked toward the back of the room where the two individuals sat. "I'm not saying this because I want revenge," he said softly. "I'm saying this because I don't want to live with lies anymore. I don't want to be known as something I'm not." One of those individuals lowered their head. The other stared straight ahead, frozen. The judge calmly asked, "Are you stating that the accusations against you were created by those individuals?" "Yes," the young man replied. "They planned everything. They did things I didn't know about. And when it went wrong, they pushed all the blame onto me." The courtroom erupted with murmurs. It was impossible to ignore the tension. Even the reporters in the back seemed unsure whether they should take notes or just listen. The judge raised his hand, signaling for silence. Then he looked at the two individuals at the back and instructed the officers to bring them forward. When they were brought to the front, they looked visibly nervous. The judge questioned them one by one. Their body language told a story even before their words did. They avoided eye contact. They hesitated. They contradicted themselves. They stuttered. Slowly, their version of events began falling apart. The truth was cracking through, piece by piece. The young man stood there silently as they struggled to explain themselves. He didn't smirk. He didn't look satisfied. He looked tired but lighter, as if speaking the truth had finally freed him from something heavy. After a long and intense questioning session, the judge called for a brief break. The courtroom buzzed with reactions. People whispered things like, "I can't believe it," and "He wasn't lying," and "Everything makes sense now." His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "You did the right thing. You finally let the truth speak." He nodded, but he didn't feel triumphant. He felt relieved, and relief was worth more than victory. When the session resumed, the judge looked more serious than ever. He reviewed the statements, the contradictions, the evidence, and the young man's honesty. Then he looked directly at him and said, "Your silence caused confusion, but your honesty has brought clarity." The judge paused. The entire courtroom held its breath. "The court finds that there is not enough evidence to declare you guilty," the judge announced. "The accusations against you were built on false statements. You are free from these charges." The young man felt his knees weaken for a second. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. People in the courtroom released long breaths they had unknowingly been holding. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned toward the two individuals who had blamed him. "However, the court will now investigate the actions of those who provided misleading information." The two individuals looked terrified. For the first time, they realized the weight of what they had done. As the session ended, the courtroom slowly emptied. People walked out talking softly, still shocked by everything they had witnessed. The young man stayed standing near the door, staring at the floor. His lawyer walked up to him and said gently, "Today, you didn't just clear your name. You freed yourself from the fear you carried for so long." He nodded, but still didn't speak. It was the first time in months that he didn't feel like a suspect. He felt like himself against someone who made mistakes, yes, but someone who didn't deserve the blame that had been placed on him. When he finally stepped outside the courthouse, the fresh air felt different, lighter, softer, like the world had opened up again. His shoulders didn't feel as heavy. His steps didn't feel uncertain. He looked up at the sky for a moment and let out a slow breath. It wasn't a breath of sadness. It wasn't a breath of anger. It was a breath of freedom. He knew life wouldn't be perfect from now on. There would be questions, memories, and moments of doubt. But he also knew he had done something important. He had spoken the truth, and that truth had changed everything. He walked down the courthouse steps, feeling a small sense of peace growing inside him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying a secret. He wasn't carrying guilt that didn't belong to him. He wasn't carrying anyone else's mistakes on his shoulders. He was simply walking forward, finally free.